Chapter 26 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 26. End of the flight. We pass the Forth. The month, as I have said, was not yet out, but it was already far through August, and beautiful warm weather, with every sign of an early and great harvest, when I was pronounced able for my journey. Our money was now run to so low an ebb that we must think first of all on speed, for if we came not too soon to Mr. Rankeillor's, or if when we came there he should fail to help me, we must surely starve. In Alan's view, besides, the hunt must now have greatly slackened, and the line of the Forth and even Stirling Bridge, which is the main pass over that river, would be watched with little interest. "It's a chief principle in military affairs," said he, "to go where ye are least expected. Forth is our trouble. Ye ken the saying, Forth bridles the wild Highlandman. Well, if we seek to creep round about the head of that river and come down by Kippen or Balfour, it's just precisely there that they'll be looking to lay hands on us. But if we stave on straight to the auld brig of Stirling, I'll lay my sword they'll let us pass unchallenged." The first night, accordingly, we pushed to the house of a Maclaren in Strathire, a friend of Duncan's, where we slept the 21st of the month, and whence we set forth again about the fall of night to make another easy stage. The 22nd we lay in a heather bush on the hillside in Var, within view of a herd of deer, the happiest 10 hours of sleep in a fine, breathing sunshine and on bone-dry ground that I have ever tasted. That night we struck Allan Water, and followed it down, and coming to the edge of the hills, saw the whole Carse of Stirling underfoot, as flat as a pancake, with the town and castle on a hill in the midst of it, and the moon shining on the links of Forth. "Now," said Alan, "I kenna if ye care, but ye're on your own land again. We passed the Highland line in that first hour, and now if we could but pass yon crooked water, we might cast our bonnets in the air." In Allan Water, near by where it falls into the Forth, we found a little sandy islet, overgrown with burdock, butterbur, and the like low plants, that would just cover us if we lay flat. Here it was we made our camp, within plain view of Stirling Castle, whence we could hear the drums beat as some part of the garrison paraded. And we could hear the stones going on the hooks, and the voices, and even the words of the men talking. It behoved to lie close and keep silent. But the sand of the little isle was sun-warm, the green plants gave us shelter for our heads, we had food and drink in plenty, and to crown all, we were within sight of safety. As soon as the shearers quit their work and the dusk began to fall, we waded ashore and struck for the bridge of Stirling, keeping to the fields and under the field fences. The bridge is close under the castle hill, an old, high, narrow bridge with pinnacles along the parapet, and you may conceive with how much interest I looked upon it, not only as a place famous in history, but as the very doors of salvation to Alan and myself. The moon was not yet up when we came there. A few lights shone along the front of the fortress, and lower down a few lighted windows in the town, but it was all mighty still, and there seemed to be no guard upon the passage. I was for pushing straight across, but Alan was more wary. "It looks unco quiet," said he, "but for all that we'll lie down here cannily behind a dyke, and make sure." So we lay for about a quarter of an hour, whiles whispering, whiles lying still, and hearing nothing earthly but the washing of the water on the piers. At last there came by an old hobbling woman with a crutch stick, who first stopped a little, close to where we lay, and bemoaned herself and the long way she had travelled, and then set forth again up the steep spring of the bridge. The woman was so little, and the night still so dark, that we soon lost sight of her, only heard the sound of her steps, and her stick, and a cough that she had by fits, draw slowly farther away. "She's bound to be across now," I whispered. "Na," said Alan. Her foot still sounds boss upon the bridge." And just then, "Who goes?" cried a voice, and we heard the butt of a musket rattle on the stones. I must suppose the sentry had been sleeping, so that had we tried, we might have passed unseen; but he was awake now, and the chance forfeited. "This'll never do," said Alan. "This'll never, never do for us, David." And without another word, he began to crawl away through the fields; and a little after, being well out of eyeshot, got to his feet again, and struck along a road that led to the eastward. I could not conceive what he was doing, and indeed I was so sharply cut by the disappointment, that I was little likely to be pleased with anything. A moment back and I had seen myself knocking at Mr. Rankeillor's door to claim my inheritance, like a hero in a ballad; and here was I back again, a wandering hunted blackguard, on the wrong side of Forth. "Well?" said I. "Well," said Alan, "what would ye have? They're none such fools as I took 'em for. We have still the Forth to pass, Davie, weary fall the rains that fed and the hillsides that guided it." "And why go east?" said I. "Oh, just upon the chance," said he. "If we cannae pass the river, we'll have to see what we can do for the firth." "There are fords upon the river, and none upon the firth," said I. "To be sure there are fords, and a bridge forby," quoth Alan. "And of what service when they are watched?" "Well," said I, "but a river can be swum." "By them that have the skill of it," returned he. "But I have yet to hear that either you or me is much of a hand at that exercise; and for my own part, I swim like a stone." "I'm not up to you in talking back, Alan," I said, "but I can see we're making bad worse. If it's hard to pass a river, it stands to reason it must be worse to pass a sea." "But there's such a thing as a boat," says Alan, "or I'm the more deceived." "Ay, and such a thing as money," says I; "but for us that have neither one nor other, they might just as well not have been invented." "Ye think so?" said Alan. "I do that," said I. "David," says he, "you're a man of small invention and less faith. But let me set my wits upon the hone, and if I cannae beg, borrow, or yet steal a boat, I'll make one." "I think I see ye," said I. "And what's more than all of that, if ye pass a bridge, it can tell no tales; but if we pass the firth, there's the boat on the wrong side. Somebody must have brought it. The countryside will all be in a buzz." "Man," cried Alan, "if I can make a boat, I'll make a body to take it back again. So deave me with no more of your nonsense, but walk, for that's what you've got to do, and let Alan think for ye." All night, then, we walked through the north side of the Carse under the high line of the Orkhill mountains, and by Alloa and Clackmannan and Culross, all of which we avoided; and about 10 in the morning, mighty hungry and tired, came to the little clachan of Limekilns. This is a place that sits near in by the waterside, and looks across the Hope to the town of the Queensferry. Smoke went up from both of these, and from other villages and farms upon all hands. The fields were being reaped, 2 ships lay anchored, and boats were coming and going on the Hope. It was altogether a right pleasant sight to me, and I could not take my fill of gazing at these comfortable green cultivated hills and the busy people both of the field and sea. For all that, there was Mr. Rankeillor's house on the south shore, where I had no doubt wealth awaited me; and here was I upon the north, clad in poor enough attire of an outlandish fashion, with 3 silver shillings left to me of all my fortune, a price set upon my head, and an outlawed man for my sole company. "Oh, Alan," said I, "to think of it! Over there, there's all that heart could want waiting me; and the birds go over, and the boats go over; all that please can go, but just me only. Oh, man, but it's a heartbreak!" In Limekilns we entered a small change house, which we only knew to be a public by the wand over the door, and bought some bread and cheese from a good looking lass that was the servant. This we carried with us in a bundle, meaning to sit and eat it in a bush of wood on the seashore, that we saw some third part of a mile in front. As we went, I kept looking across the water and sighing to myself, and though I took no heed of it, Alan had fallen into a muse. At last he stopped in the way. "Do ye take heed of the lass we bought this of?" says he, tapping on the bread and cheese. "To be sure," said I, "and a bonny lass she was." "Ye thought sae? Ye thought that?" cries he. "Man, David, that's good news." "In the name of all that's wonderful, why so?" says I. "What good can that do?" "Well," said Alan, with one of his droll looks, "I was rather in hopes it would maybe get us that boat." "If it were the other way about, it would be liker it," said I. "That's all you ken, ye see," said Alan. "I don't want the lass to fall in love with ye. I want her to be sorry for ye, David, to which end there is no manner of need that she should take you for a beauty. Let me see," looking me curiously over. "I wish ye were a wee thing paler, but apart from that ye'll do fine for my purpose. Ye have a fine hang-dog, rag and tatter, clapper-maclaw kind of a look to ye, as if ye'd stolen the coat from a potato bogle. Come, right about, and back to the change-house for that boat of ours." I followed him, laughing. "David Balfour," said he, "you're a very funny gentleman by your way of it, and this is a very funny employ for ye, no doubt. For all that, if ye have any affection for my neck, to say nothing of your own, ye will perhaps be kind enough to take this matter responsibly. I am going to do a bit of play-acting, the bottom ground of which is just exactly as serious as the gallows for the pair of us. So bear it, if ye please, in mind, and conduct yourself according." "Well, well," said I, "have it as you will." As we got near the clachan, he made me take his arm and hang upon it like one almost helpless with weariness; and by the time he pushed open the change-house door, he seemed to be half carrying me. The maid appeared surprised, as well she might be, at our speedy return; but Alan had no words to spare for her in explanation, helped me to a chair, called for a tass of brandy with which he fed me in little sips, and then breaking up the bread and cheese helped me to eat it like a nursery lass, the whole with that grave, concerned, affectionate countenance that might have imposed upon a judge. It was small wonder if the maid were taken with the picture we presented, of a poor, sick, overwrought lad and his most tender comrade. She drew quite near, and stood leaning with her back on the next table. "What's like wrong with him?" said she at last. Alan turned upon her, to my great wonder, with a kind of fury. "Wrong!" cries he. "He's walked more hundreds of miles than he has hairs upon his chin, and slept oftener in wet heather than dry sheets. Wrong, quoth she! Wrong enough, I would think. Wrong indeed!" And he kept grumbling to himself as he fed me, like a man ill pleased. "He's young for the like of that," said the maid. "Ower young," said Alan, with his back to her. "He would be better riding," said she. "And where could I get a horse to him?" cried Alan, turning on her with the same appearance of fury. "Would ye have me steal?" I thought this roughness would have sent her off in dudgeon, as indeed it closed her mouth for the time; but my companion knew very well what he was doing, and for as simple as he was in some things of life, had a great fund of roguishness in such affairs as these. "Ye neednae tell me," she said at last. "Ye're gentry." "Well," said Alan, softened a little, I believe against his will, by this artless comment, "and suppose we were. Did ever you hear the gentrice put money in folks' pockets?" She sighed at this, as if she were herself some disinherited great lady. "No," says she, "that's true indeed." I was all this while chafing at the part I played, and sitting tongue-tied between shame and merriment; but somehow at this I could hold in no longer, and bade Alan let me be, for I was better already. My voice stuck in my throat, for I ever hated to take part in lies; but my very embarrassment helped on the plot, for the lass no doubt set down my husky voice to sickness and fatigue. "Has he nae friends?" said she in a tearful voice. "That has he so!" cried Alan. "If we could but win to them! Friends and rich friends, beds to lie in, food to eat,
doctors to see to him, and here he must tramp in the dubs, and sleep in the heather like a beggarman." "And why that?" says the lass. "My dear," said Alan, "I canna very safely say, but I'll tell ye what I'll do instead," says he. "I'll whistle ye a bit tune." And with that he leaned pretty far over the table, and in a mere breath of a whistle, but with a wonderful pretty sentiment, gave her a few bars of "Charlie is my darling." "Wheesht!" says she, and looked over her shoulder to the door. "That's it," said Alan. "And him so young!" cries the lass. "He's old enough to—" and Alan stuck his forefinger on the back part of his neck, meaning that I was old enough to lose my head. "It would be a black shame!" she cried, flushing high. "It's what will be, though," said Alan, "unless we manage the better." At this the lass turned and ran out of that part of the house, leaving us alone together. Alan in high good humour at the furthering of his schemes, and I in bitter dudgeon at being called a Jacobite and treated like a child. "Alan," I cried, "I can stand no more of this." "Ye have to sit it then, Davie," said he, "for if ye upset the pot now, ye may scrape your own life out of the fire, but Alan Breck is a dead man." This was so true that I could only groan, and even my groan served Alan's purpose, for it was overheard by the lass as she came flying in again with a dish of white puddings and a bottle of strong ale. "Poor lamb!" says she, and had no sooner set the meat before us than she touched me on the shoulder with a little friendly touch, as much as to bid me cheer up. Then she told us to fall to, and there would be no more to pay, for the inn was her own, or at least her father's, and he was gone for the day to Pittencrieff. We waited for no second bidding, for bread and cheese is but cold comfort, and the puddings smelt excellently well. And while we sat and ate, she took up that same place by the next table, looking on and thinking, and frowning to herself, and drawing the string of her apron through her hand. "I'm thinking you have a rather long tongue," she said at last to Alan. "Ay," said Alan, "but ye see, I ken the folk I speak to." "I would never betray ye," said she, "if ye mean that." "No," said he, "you're not that kind; but I'll tell you what ye would do. Ye would help." "I couldnae," said she, shaking her head. "Na, I couldnae." "No," said he, "but if ye could?" She answered him nothing. "Look here, my lass," said Alan. "There are boats in the kingdom of Fife, for I saw two, no less, upon the beach, as I came in by your town's end. Now, if we could have the use of a boat to pass under cloud of night into Lothian, and some secret, decent kind of a man to bring that boat back again and keep his counsel, there would be two souls saved, mine to all likelihood, his to a dead surety. If we lack that boat, we have but 3 shillings left in the wide world, and where to go, and how to do, and what other place there is for us except the chains of a gibbet. I give you my naked word, I kenna. Shall we go wanting, lassie? Are ye to lie in your warm bed and think upon us, when the wind gowls in the chimney and the rain tirls on the roof? Are ye to eat your meat by the cheeks of a red fire, and think upon this poor sick lad of mine, biting his finger ends on a blame muir for cold and hunger? Sick or sound, he must aye be moving; with the death grapple at his throat he must aye be trailing in the rain on the long roads; and when he gants his last on a rickle of cauld stones, there will be nae friends near him but only me and God." At this appeal, I could see the lass was in a great trouble of mind, being tempted to help us, and yet in some fear she might be helping malefactors; and so now I determined to step in myself and to allay her scruples with a portion of the truth. "Do you ever hear," said I, "of Mr. Rankeillor of the Ferry?" "Rankeillor? Rankeillor the writer?" said she. "I daur say that." "Well," said I, "it's to his door that I am bound; so you may judge by that if I am an ill doer; and I will tell you more, that though I am indeed, by a dreadful error, in some peril of my life, King George has no truer friend in all Scotland than myself."
Her face cleared up mightily at this, although Alan's darkened.
"That's more than I would ask," said she. "Mr. Rankeillor is a Kent man."
And she bade us finish our meat, get clear of the clachan as soon as might be, and lie close in the bit wood on the sea beach.
"And ye can trust me," says she. "I'll find some means to put you over."
At this we waited for no more, but shook hands with her upon the bargain, made short work of the puddings, and set forth again from Limekilns as far as to the wood. It was a small piece of perhaps a score of elders and hawthorns and a few young ashes, not thick enough to veil us from passers by upon the road or beach. Here we must lie, however, making the best of the brave warm weather and the good hopes we now had of a deliverance, and planning more particularly what remained for us to do. We had but one trouble all day, when a strolling piper came and sat in the same wood with us, a red-nosed, bleary-eyed, drunken dog, with a great bottle of whisky in his pocket, and a long story of wrongs that had been done him by all sorts of persons, from the Lord President of the Court of Session, who had denied him justice, down to the bailies of Inverkeithing, who had given him more of it than he desired. It was impossible but that he should conceive some suspicion of two men lying all day concealed in a thicket and having no business to allege. As long as he stayed there he kept us in hot water with prying questions, and after he was gone, as he was a man not very likely to hold his tongue, we were in the greater impatience to be gone ourselves. The day came to an end with the same brightness, the night fell quiet and clear. Lights came out in houses and hamlets, and then, one after another, began to be put out. But it was past 11, and we were long since strangely tortured with anxieties, before we heard the grinding of oars upon the rowing pins. At that we looked out and saw the lass herself coming rowing to us in a boat. She had trusted no one with our affairs, not even her sweetheart, if she had one, but as soon as her father was asleep, had left the house by a window, stolen a neighbour's boat, and come to our assistance single-handed. I was abashed how to find expression for my thanks, but she was no less abashed at the thought of hearing them, begged us to lose no time and to hold our peace, saying, very properly, that the heart of our matter was in haste and silence, and so, what with one thing and another, she had set us on the Lothian shore not far from Caradon, had shaken hands with us, and was out again at sea and rowing for Limekilns, before there was one word said either of her service or our gratitude. Even after she was gone we had nothing to say, as indeed nothing was enough for such a kindness. Only Alan stood a great while upon the shore, shaking his head. "It is a very fine lass," he said at last. "David, it is a very fine lass." And a matter of an hour later, as we were lying in a den on the seashore, and I had been already dozing, he broke out again in commendations of her character. For my part, I could say nothing; she was so simple a creature that my heart smote me, both with remorse and fear: remorse because we had traded upon her ignorance, and fear lest we should have any way involved her in the dangers of our situation. End of chapter. Chapter 27 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 27. I come to Mr. Rankeillor. The next day it was agreed that Alan should fend for himself till sunset, but as soon as it began to grow dark, he should lie in the fields by the roadside near to Newhalls, and stir for naught until he heard me whistling. At first I proposed I should give him for a signal the bonny house of Airlie, which was a favourite of mine, but he objected that as the piece was very commonly known, any ploughman might whistle it by accident, and taught me instead a little fragment of a Highland air, which has run in my head from that day to this, and will likely run in my head when I lie dying. Every time it comes to me it takes me off to that last day of my uncertainty, with Alan sitting up in the bottom of the den, whistling and beating the measure with a finger, and the grey of the dawn coming on his face. I was in the long street of Queensferry before the sun was up. It was a fairly built burg, the houses of good stone, many slated, the town hall not so fine, I thought, as that of Peebles, nor yet the street so noble, but take it altogether, it put me to shame for my foul tatters. As the morning went on, and the fires began to be kindled, and the windows to open, and the people to appear out of the houses, my concern and despondency grew ever the blacker. I saw now that I had no grounds to stand upon, and no clear proof of my rights, nor so much as of my own identity. If it was all a bubble, I was indeed sorely cheated and left in a sore pass. Even if things were as I conceived, it would in all likelihood take time to establish my contentions, and what time had I to spare with less than 3 shillings in my pocket, and a condemned hunted man upon my hands to ship out of the country? Truly, if my hope broke with me, it might come to the gallows yet for both of us. And as I continued to walk up and down, and saw people looking askance at me upon the street or out of windows, and nudging or speaking one to another with smiles, I began to take a fresh apprehension that it might be no easy matter even to come to speech of the lawyer, far less to convince him of my story. For the life of me I could not muster up the courage to address any of these reputable burghers. I thought shame even to speak with them in such a pickle of rags and dirt, and if I had asked for the house of such a man as Mr. Rankeillor, I suppose they would have burst out laughing in my face. So I went up and down, and through the street, and down to the harbour side, like a dog that has lost its master, with a strange gnawing in my inwards, and every now and then a movement of despair. It grew to be high day at last, perhaps 9 in the forenoon, and I was worn with these wanderings, and chanced to have stopped in front of a very good house on the landward side, a house with beautiful clear glass windows, flowering knots upon the sills, the walls new harled, and a chase dog sitting yawning on the step like one that was at home. Well, I was even envying this dumb brute, when the door fell open, and there issued forth a shrewd, ruddy, kindly, consequential man in a well-powdered wig and spectacles. I was in such a plight that no one set eyes on me once, but he looked at me again. And this gentleman, as it proved, was so much struck with my poor appearance that he came straight up to me and asked me what I did. I told him I was come to the Queensferry on business, and taking heart of grace, asked him to direct me to the house of Mr. Rankeillor. "Why," said he, "that is his house that I have just come out of, and for a rather singular chance I am that very man." "Then, sir," said I have to beg the favour of an interview." "I do not know your name," said he, "nor yet your face." "My name is David Balfour," said I. "David Balfour," he repeated, in rather a high tone, like one surprised. "And where have you come from, Mr. David Balfour?" he asked, looking me pretty dryly in the face. "I have come from a great many strange places, sir," said I, "but I think it would be as well to tell you where and how in a more private manner." He seemed to muse a while, holding his lip in his hand, and looking now at me and now upon the causeway of the street. "Yes," says he, "that will be the best, no doubt." And he led me back with him into his house, cried out to some one whom I could not see that he would be engaged all morning, and brought me into a little dusty chamber full of books and documents. Here he sat down, and bade me be seated, though I thought he looked a little ruefully from his clean chair to my muddy rags. "And now," says he, "if you have any business, pray be brief and come swiftly to the point. Nec gemino bellum Trojanum orditur ab vovo. Do you understand that?" says he, with a keen look. "I will even do as Horace says, sir," I answered, smiling, "and carry you in medias res." He nodded as if he was well pleased, and indeed his scrap of Latin had been set to test me. For all that, and though I was somewhat encouraged, the blood came in my face when I added, I have reason to believe myself some rights on the estate of Shaws." He got a paper book out of a drawer, and set it before him, open. "Well?" said he. But I had shot my bolt, and sat speechless. "Come, come, Mr. Balfour," said he, "you must continue. Where were you born?" "In Essendine, sir," said I. "The year 1733, the 12th of March." He seemed to follow this statement in his paper book, but what that meant I knew not. "Your father and mother?" said he. "My father was Alexander Balfour, schoolmaster of that place," said I, "and my mother Grace Peterrow. I think her people were from Angus." "Have you any papers proving your identity?" asked Mr. Rankeillor. "No, sir," said I, "but they are in the hands of Mr. Campbell, the minister, and could be readily produced. Mr. Campbell, too, would give me his word, and for that matter I do not think my uncle would deny me." "Meaning Mr. Ebenezer Balfour?" says he. "The same," said I. "Whom have you seen?" he asked. "By whom I was received into his own house," I answered. "Did you ever meet a man of the name of Hoseason?" asked Mr. Rankeillor. "I did so, sir, for my sins," said I, "for it was by his means and the procurement of my uncle that I was kidnapped within sight of this town, carried to sea, suffered shipwreck and 100 other hardships, and stand before you today in this poor accoutrement." "You say you were shipwrecked," said Rankeillor. "Where was that?" "Off the south end of the Isle of Mull," said I. "The name of the isle on which I was cast up is the Island Ered." "Ah!" says he, smiling. "You are deeper than me in the geography. But so far, I may tell you, this agrees pretty exactly with other informations that I hold. But you say you were kidnapped. In what sense?" "In the plain meaning of the word, sir," said I. "I was on my way to your house when I was trepanned on board the brig, cruelly struck down, thrown below, and knew no more of anything till we were far at sea. I was destined for the plantations, a fate that, in God's providence, I have escaped." "The brig was lost on June the 27th," says he, looking in his book, "and we are now at August the 24th. Here is a considerable hiatus, Mr. Balfour, of near upon 2 months. It has already caused a vast amount of trouble to your friends, and I own I shall not be very well contented until it is set right." "Indeed, sir," said I, "these months are very easily filled up; but yet before I told my story, I would be glad to know that I was talking to a friend." "This is to argue in a circle," said the lawyer. "I cannot be convinced till I have heard you. I cannot be your friend till I am properly informed. If you were more trustful, it would better befit your time of life. And you know, Mr. Balfour, we have a proverb in the country that evildoers are aye evil dreaders." "You are not to forget, sir," said I, "that I have already suffered by my trustfulness, and was shipped off to be a slave by the very man that, if I rightly understand, is your employer?" All this while I had been gaining ground with Mr. Rankeillor, and in proportion as I gained ground, gaining confidence. But at this sally, which I made with something of a smile myself, he fairly laughed aloud. "No, no," said he, "it is not so bad as that. Fui non sum. I was indeed your uncle's man of business, but while you, immerbis juvenis custode remoto, were gallivanting in the west, a good deal of water has run under the bridges, and if your ears did not sing, it was not for lack of being talked about. On the very day of your sea disaster, Mr. Campbell stalked into my office, demanding you from all the winds. I had never heard of your existence, but I had known your father, and from matters in my competence, to be touched upon hereafter, I was disposed to fear the worst. Mr. Ebenezer admitted having seen you, declared, what seemed improbable, that he had given you considerable sums, and that you had started for the continent of Europe.
intending to fulfil your education, which was probable and praiseworthy. Interrogated how you had come to send no word to Mr. Campbell, he deponed that you had expressed a great desire to break with your past life. Further interrogated where you now were, protested ignorance, but believed you were in Leyden. That is a close sum of his replies. I am not exactly sure that any one believed him," continued Mr. Rankeillor with a smile, "and in particular he so much disrelished me expressions of mine that, in a word, he showed me to the door. We were then at a full stand, for whatever shrewd suspicions we might entertain, we had no shadow of probation. In the very article comes Captain Hoseason with the story of your drowning, whereupon all fell through, with no consequences but concern to Mr. Campbell, injury to my pocket, and another blot upon your uncle's character, which could very ill afford it. And now, Mr. Balfour," said he, "you understand the whole process of these matters, and can judge for yourself to what extent I may be trusted." Indeed, he was more pedantic than I can represent him, and placed more scraps of Latin in his speech, but it was all uttered with a fine geniality of eye and manner which went far to conquer my distrust. Moreover, I could see he now treated me as if I was myself beyond a doubt, so that first part of my identity seemed fully granted. "Sir," said I, "if I tell you my story, I must commit a friend's life to your discretion. Pass me your word it shall be sacred, and for what touches myself I will ask no better guarantee than just your face." He passed me his word very seriously. "But," said he, "these are rather alarming prolocutions, and if there are in your story any little jostles to the law, I would beg you to bear in mind that I am a lawyer, and pass lightly." Thereupon I told him my story from the first, he listening with his spectacles thrust up and his eyes closed, so that I sometimes feared he was asleep. But no such matter; he heard every word, as I found afterward, with such quickness of hearing and precision of memory as often surprised me. Even strange outlandish Gaelic names, heard for that time only, he remembered and would remind me of years after. Yet when I called Alan Breck in full, we had an odd scene. The name of Alan had of course rung through Scotland, with the news of the Appin murder and the offer of the reward, and it had no sooner escaped me than the lawyer moved in his seat and opened his eyes. "I would name no unnecessary names, Mr. Balfour," said he, "above all of Highlanders, many of whom are obnoxious to the law." "Well, it might have been better not," said I, "but since I have let it slip I may as well continue." "Not at all," said Mr. Rankeillor. "I am somewhat dull of hearing, as you may have remarked, and I am far from sure I caught the name exactly. We will call your friend, if you please, Mr. Thomas, that there may be no reflections. And in future I would take some such way with any Highlander that you may have to mention, dead or alive." By this I saw he must have heard the name all too clearly, and had already guessed I might be coming to the murder. If he chose to play this part of ignorance, it was no matter of mine, so I smiled, said it was no very Highland-sounding name, and consented. Through all the rest of my story Alan was Mr. Thomson, which amused me the more, as it was a piece of policy after his own heart. James Stewart, in like manner, was mentioned under the style of Mr. Thomson's kinsman. Colin Campbell passed as Mr. Glen, and to Cluny, when I came to that part of my tale, I gave the name of Mr. Jameson, a Highland chief. It was truly the most open farce, and I wondered that the lawyer should care to keep it up. But, after all, it was quite in the taste of that age, when there were two parties in the state, and quiet persons, with no very high opinions of their own, sought out every cranny to avoid offence to either. "Well, well," said the lawyer when I had quite done, "this is a great epic, a great Odyssey of yours. You must tell it, sir, in a sound Latinity when your scholarship is riper, or in English if you please, though for my part I prefer the stronger tongue. You have rolled much, quae regio in terris. What parish in Scotland, to make a homely translation, has not been filled with your wanderings? You have shown, besides, a singular aptitude for getting into false positions, and, yes, upon the whole, for behaving well in them. This Mr. Thomson seems to me a gentleman of some choice qualities, though perhaps a trifle bloody-minded. It would please me none the worse if, with all his merits, he were soused in the North Sea, for the man, Mr. David, is a sore embarrassment. But you are doubtless quite right to adhere to him. Indubitably he adhered to you. It comes, we may say, he was your true companion, nor less paribus curus vestigia figit, for I dare say you would both take an ora thought upon the gallows. Well, well, these days are fortunately by, and I think, speaking humanly, that you are near the end of your troubles. As he thus moralized on my adventures, he looked upon me with so much humour and benignity that I could scarce contain my satisfaction. I had been so long wandering with lawless people, and making my bed upon the hills and under the bare sky, that to sit once more in a clean, covered house, and to talk amicably with a gentleman in broadcloth, seemed mighty elevations. Even as I thought so, my eye fell on my unseemly tatters, and I was once more plunged in confusion. But the lawyer saw and understood me. He rose, called over the stair to lay another plate, for Mr. Balfour would stay to dinner, and led me into a bedroom in the upper part of the house. Here he set before me water and soap, and a comb, and laid out some clothes that belonged to his son, and here, with another apposite tag, he left me to my toilet. End of chapter. Chapter 28 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 28. I go in quest of my inheritance. I made what change I could in my appearance, and blithe was I to look in the glass and find the beggarman a thing of the past, and David Balfour come to life again. And yet I was ashamed of the change too, and above all of the borrowed clothes. When I had done, Mr. Rankeillor caught me on the stair, made me his compliments, and had me again into the cabinet. "Sit ye down, Mr. David," said he, "and now you are looking a little more like yourself, let me see if I can find you any news. You will be wondering, no doubt, about your father and your uncle? To be sure, it is a singular tale, and the explanation is one that I blush to have to offer you. For," says he, really with embarrassment, "the matter hinges on a love affair." "Truly," said I cannot very well join that notion with my uncle." "But your uncle, Mr. David, was not always old," replied the lawyer, "and what may perhaps surprise you more, not always ugly. He had a fine gallant air; people stood in their doors to look after him, as he went by upon a mettle horse. I have seen it with these eyes, and I ingenuously confess, not altogether without envy, for I was a plain lad myself and a plain man's son, and in those days it was a case of odi te que bellis es sa belle." "It sounds like a dream," said I. "Ay, ay," said the lawyer, "that is how it is with youth and age. Nor was that all, but he had a spirit of his own that seemed to promise great things in the future. In 1715, what must he do but run away to join the rebels? It was your father that pursued him, found him in a ditch, and brought him back multum gementum, to the mirth of the whole country. However, majora canamus, the two lads fell in love, and that with the same lady. Mr. Ebenezer, who was the admired and the beloved, and the spoiled one, made, no doubt, mighty certain of the victory, and when he found he had deceived himself, screamed like a peacock. The whole country heard of it. Now he lay sick at home, with his silly family standing round the bed in tears. Now he rode from public house to public house, and shouted his sorrows into the lug of Tom, Dick, and Harry. Your father, Mr. David, was a kind gentleman, but he was weak, dolefully weak, took all this folly with a long countenance, and one day, by your leave, resigned the lady. She was no such fool, however. It's from her you must inherit your excellent good sense, and she refused to be bandied from one to another. Both got upon their knees to her, and the upshot of the matter for that while was that she showed both of them the door. That was in August, dear me, the same year I came from college. The scene must have been highly farcical. I thought myself it was a silly business, but I could not forget my father had a hand in it. Surely, sir, it had some note of tragedy, said I. Why, no, sir, not at all, returned the lawyer. For tragedy implies some ponderable matter in dispute, some dignus vindice nodus, and this piece of work was all about the petulance of a young ass that had been spoiled, and wanted nothing so much as to be tied up and soundly belted. However, that was not your father's view, and the end of it was, that from concession to concession on your father's part, and from one height to another of squalling, sentimental selfishness upon your uncle's, they came at last to drive a sort of bargain, from whose ill results you have recently been smarting. The one man took the lady, the other the estate. Now, Mr. David, they talk a great deal of charity and generosity, but in this disputable state of life, I often think the happiest consequences seem to flow when a gentleman consults his lawyer, and takes all the law allows him. Anyhow, this piece of Quixotry, on your father's part, as it was unjust in itself, has brought forth a monstrous family of injustices. Your father and mother lived and died poor folk, you were poorly reared, and in the meanwhile, what a time it has been for the tenants on the estate of Shaw's. And I might add, if it was a matter I cared much about, what a time for Mr. Ebenezer! And yet that is certainly the strangest part of all, said I, that a man's nature should thus change. True, said Mr. Rankeillor, and yet I imagine it was natural enough. He could not think that he had played a handsome part. Those who knew the story gave him the cold shoulder. Those who knew it not, seeing one brother disappear, and the other succeed in the estate, raised a cry of murder, so that upon all sides he found himself evited. Money was all he got by his bargain. Well, he came to think the more of money. He was selfish when he was young. He is selfish now that he is old, and the latter end of all these pretty manners and fine feelings you have seen for yourself. Well, sir, said I, and in all this what is my position? The estate is yours beyond a doubt, replied the lawyer. It matters nothing what your father signed. You are the heir of entail. But your uncle is a man to fight the indefensible, and it would be likely your identity that he would call in question. A lawsuit is always expensive, and a family lawsuit always scandalous. Besides which, if any of your doings with your friend Mr. Thomson were to come out, we might find that we had burned our fingers. The kidnapping, to be sure, would be a court card upon our side, if we could only prove it. But it may be difficult to prove, and my advice, upon the whole, is to make a very easy bargain with your uncle, perhaps even leaving him at Shaw's, where he has taken root for a quarter of a century, and contenting yourself in the meanwhile with a fair provision. I told him I was very willing to be easy, and that to carry family concerns before the public was a step from which I was naturally much averse. In the meantime, thinking to myself, I began to see the outlines of that scheme on which we afterwards acted. The great affair, I asked, is to bring home to him the kidnapping? "Surely," said Mr. Rankeillor, "and if possible, out of court. For mark you here, Mr. David, we could no doubt find some men of the Covenant who would swear to your reclusion; but once they were in the box, we could no longer check their testimony, and some word of your friend Mr. Thomson must certainly crop out. Which, from what you have let fall, I cannot think to be desirable." "Well, sir," said I, "here is my way of it." And I opened my plot to him. "But this would seem to involve my meeting the man Thomson?" says he, when I had done. "I think so, indeed, sir," said I. "Dear doctor!" cries he, rubbing his brow. "Dear doctor! No, Mr. David, I am afraid your scheme is inadmissible. I say nothing against your friend Mr. Thomson. I know nothing about him; and if I did, mark this, Mr. David, it would be my duty to lay hands on him. Now I put it to you, is it wise to meet? He may have matters to his charge. He may not have told you all. His name may not be even Thomson," cries the lawyer, twinkling. "For some of these fellows will pick up names by the roadside as another would gather haws." "You must be the judge, sir," said I. But it was clear my plan had taken hold upon his fancy, for he kept musing to himself till we were called to dinner and the company of Mrs. Rankeillor, and that lady had scarce left us again to ourselves and a bottle of wine, ere he was back harping on my proposal. When and where was I to meet my friend Mr. Thomson? Was I sure of Mr. T.'s discretion, supposing we could catch the old fox tripping? Would I consent to such and such a term of an agreement? These and the like questions he kept asking at long intervals, while he thoughtfully rolled his wine upon his tongue. When I had answered all of them, seemingly to his contentment, he fell into a still deeper muse, even the claret being now forgotten. Then he got a sheet of paper and a pencil, and set to work writing and weighing every word, and at last touched a bell and had his clerk into the chamber. "Torrance," said he, "I must have this written out fair against to night; and when it is done, you'll be so kind as to put on your hat and be ready to come along with this gentleman and me, for you will probably be wanted as a witness." "What, sir," cried I, as soon as the clerk was gone, "are you to venture it?" "Why, so it would appear," says he, filling his glass. "But let us speak no more of business. The very sight of Torrance brings in my head a little droll matter of some years ago, when I had made a tryst with the poor oaf at the cross of Edinburgh. Each had gone his proper errand, and when it came 4 o'clock, Torrance had been taking a glass and did not know his master, and I, who had forgot my spectacles, was so blind without them, that I give you my word I did not know my own clerk." And thereupon he laughed heartily. I said it was an odd chance, and smiled out of politeness; but what held me all the afternoon in wonder, he kept returning and dwelling on this story, and telling it again with fresh details and laughter, so that I began at last to be quite put out of countenance and feel ashamed for my friend's folly. Towards the time I had appointed with Alan, we set out from the house, Mr. Rankeillor and I arm in arm, and Torrance following behind with the deed in his pocket and a covered basket in his hand. All through the town the lawyer was bowing right and left, and continually being buttonholed by gentlemen on matters of burgh or private business, and I could see he was one greatly looked up to in the county. At last we were clear of the houses, and began to go along the side of the haven and towards the Hawes Inn and the Ferry Pier, the scene of my misfortune. I could not look upon the place without emotion, recalling how many that had been there with me that day were now no more; ransom taken, I could hope, from the evil to come; Shuan passed where I dared not follow him; and the poor souls that had gone down with the brig in her last plunge. All these, and the brig herself, I had outlived, and come through these hardships and fearful perils without scathe. My only thought should have been of gratitude, and yet I could not behold the place without sorrow for others and a chill of recollected fear.
I was so thinking when, upon a sudden, Mr. Rankeillor cried out, clapped his hand to his pockets, and began to laugh. "Why," he cries, "if this be not a farcical adventure! After all that I said, I have forgot my glasses." At that, of course, I understood the purpose of his anecdote, and knew that if he had left his spectacles at home, it had been done on purpose, so that he might have the benefit of Alan's help without the awkwardness of recognizing him. And indeed it was well thought upon, for now, suppose things to go the very worst, how could Rankeillor swear to my friend's identity, or how be made to bear damaging evidence against myself? For all that, he had been a long while of finding out his want, and had spoken to and recognized a good few persons as we came through the town, and I had little doubt myself that he saw reasonably well. As soon as we were past the Hawes, where I recognized the landlord smoking his pipe at the door, and was amazed to see him look no older, Mr. Rankeillor changed the order of march, walking behind with Torrance and sending me forward in the manner of a scout. I went up the hill, whistling from time to time my Gaelic air, and at length I had the pleasure to hear it answered, and to see Alan rise from behind a bush. He was somewhat dashed in spirits, having passed a long day alone skulking in the county, and made but a poor meal in an alehouse near Dundas. But at the mere sight of my clothes he began to brighten up, and as soon as I had told him in what a forward state our matters were, and the part I looked to him to play in what remained, he sprang into a new man. "And this is a very good notion of yours," said he, "and I dare to say that you could lay your hands upon no better man to put it through than Alan Breck. It is not a thing, mark ye, that any one could do, but takes a gentleman of penetration. But it sticks in my head your lawyer man will be somewhat wearying to see me," says Alan. Accordingly I cried and waved on Mr. Rankeillor, who came up alone and was presented to my friend, Mr. Thomson. "Mr. Thomson, I am pleased to meet you," said he. "But I have forgotten my glasses, and our friend, Mr. David here," clapping me on the shoulder, "will tell you that I am little better than blind, and that you must not be surprised if I pass you by to-morrow." This he said, thinking that Alan would be pleased, but the Highlandman's vanity was ready to struttle at a less manner than that. "Why, sir," says he, stiffly, "I would say it mattered the less as we are met here for a particular end, to see justice done to Mr. Balfour, and by what I can see, not very likely to have much else in common. But I accept your apology, which was a very proper one to make." "And that is more than I could look for, Mr. Thomson," said Rankeillor heartily. "And now as you and I are the chief actors in this enterprise, I think we should come into a nice agreement, to which end, I propose that you should lend me your arm; for, what with the dusk and the want of my glasses, I am not very clear as to the path. And as for you, Mr. David, you will find Torrance a pleasant kind of body to speak with. Only let me remind you, it's quite needless he should hear more of your adventures, or those of Mr. Thomson." Accordingly, these two went on ahead in very close talk, and Torrance and I brought up the rear. Night was quite come when we came in view of the house of Shaws. 10 had been gone some time. It was dark and mild, with a pleasant rustling wind in the southwest that covered the sound of our approach, and as we drew near we saw no glimmer of light in any portion of the building. It seemed my uncle was already in bed, which was indeed the best thing for our arrangements. We made our last whispered consultation some 50 yards away, and then the lawyer and Torrance and I crept quietly up and crouched down beside the corner of the house, and as soon as we were in our places, Alan strode to the door without concealment and began to knock. End of chapter. Chapter 29 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 29. I Come into My Kingdom. For some time Alan volleyed upon the door, and his knocking only roused the echoes of the house and neighbourhood. At last, however, I could hear the noise of a window gently thrust up, and knew that my uncle had come to his observatory. By what light there was, he could see Alan standing like a dark shadow on the steps. The three witnesses were hidden quite out of his view, so that there was nothing to alarm an honest man in his own house. For all that, he studied his visitor a while in silence, and when he spoke his voice had a quaver of misgiving.
"What's this?" says he. "This is no kind of time of night for decent folk, and I have no troukings with night-hawks. What brings ye here? I have a blunderbush."
"Is that yourself, Mr. Balfour?" returned Alan, stepping back and looking up into the darkness.
"Have a care of that blunderbuss. They're nasty things to burst." "What brings ye here, and what are ye?" says my uncle angrily.
"I have no manner of inclination to rout out my name to the countryside," said Alan. "But what brings me here is another story, being more of your affair than mine, and if you're sure it's what you would like, I'll set it to a tune and sing it to you."
"And what is it?"
asked my uncle. "David," says Alan.
"What was that?"
cried my uncle in a mighty changed voice. "Shall I give you the rest of the name, then?" said Alan. There was a pause, and then,
"I'm thinking I'd better let ye in,"
said my uncle, doubtfully. "I dare say that," said Alan. "But the point is, would I go? Now I will tell you what I am thinking. I am thinking that it is here upon this doorstep that we must confer upon this business, and it shall be here or nowhere at all whatever. For I would have you to understand that I am as stiff-necked as yourself, and a gentleman of better family." This change of note disconcerted Ebenezer. He was a little while digesting it, and then says he,
"Weel, weel, what must be, must,"
and shut the window. But it took him a long time to get downstairs, and a still longer to undo the fastenings, repenting, I dare say, and taken with fresh claps of fear at every second step and every bolt and bar. At last, however, we heard the creak of the hinges, and it seems my uncle slipped gingerly out, and, seeing that Alan had stepped back a pace or two, set him down on the top doorstep with the blunderbuss ready in his hands.
"And now," says he, "mind I have my blunderbush, and if ye take a step nearer you're as good as deed."
"Very civil speech," says Alan, "to be sure."
"Na," says my uncle, "but this is no very chanty kind of a proceeding, and I'm bound to be prepared. And now that we understand each other, ye can name your business."
"Why," says Alan, "you that are a man of so much understanding, will doubtless have perceived that I am a Highland gentleman. My name has no business in my story, but the county of my friends is no so very far from the Isle of Mull, of which you will have heard. It seems there was a ship lost in those parts, and the next day a gentleman of my family was seeking wreckwood for his fire along the sands, when he came upon a lad that was half drowned. Well, he brought him to, and he and some other gentlemen took and clapped him in an old ruined castle, where from that day to this he has been a great expense to my friends. My friends are a wee wild like, and not so particular about the law as some that I could name, and finding that the lad owned some decent folk, and was your born nephew, Mr. Balfour, they asked me to give you a bit of call and confer upon the matter. And I may tell ye at the off-go, unless we can agree upon some terms, ye are little likely to set eyes upon him. For my friends," added Alan simply, "are no very well off." My uncle cleared his throat. "I'm no very caring," says he. "He wasna a good lad at the best of it, and I'd nae call to interfere." "Ay, ay," said Alan. "I see what you would be at, pretending you don't care, to make the ransom smaller."
Na, said my uncle. It's the mere truth. I take no matter interest in the lad, and I pay no ransom, and you can make a kirk and a mill of him for what I care. Hoot, sir, says Alan. Blood's thicker than water, in the devil's name. Ye canna desert your brother's son for the fair shame of it, and if ye did, and it came to be kent, ye wouldna be very popular in your countryside, or I'm the more deceived. "I'm no very popular the way it is," returned Ebenezer, "and I dinna see how it would come to be kent. No by me, anyway, nor yet by you or your friends. So let's idle talk, me buckie," says he. "Then it'll have to be David that tells it," said Alan. "How's that?" says my uncle sharply. "Oh, just this way," says Alan. "My friends would doubtless keep your nephew as long as there was any likelihood of siller to be made of it; but if there was none, I am clearly of opinion they would let him gang where he pleased, and be damned to him." "Ay, but I'm no very caring about that either," said my uncle. "I wouldna be muckle made up with that." "I was thinking that," said Alan. "And what for, why?" asked Ebenezer. "Why, Mr. Balfour," replied Alan, "by all that I could hear, there were two ways of it. Either ye liked David and would pay to get him back, or else ye had very good reasons for na wanting him, and would pay for us to keep him. It seems it's not the first. Well, then, it's the second, and blithe am I to ken it, for it should be a pretty penny in my pocket and the pocket of my friends." "I dinna follow ye there," said my uncle. "No?" said Alan. "Well, see here. Ye dinna want the lad back. Well, what do ye want done with him, and how much will ye pay?" My uncle made no answer, but shifted uneasily on his seat. "Come, sir," cried Alan, "I would have ye to ken that I am a gentleman. I bear a king's name. I am no rider to kick my shanks at your hall door. Either give me an answer in civility, and that out of hand, or by the top of Glencoe, I will ram 3 feet of iron through your vitals." "Eh, man!" cried my uncle, scrambling to his feet. "Give me a minute. What's like wrong with ye? I'm just a plain man, and no dancing master, and I'm trying to be as civil as is morally possible. As for that wild talk, it's fair disreputable. Vitals, says you? And where would I be with my blunderbush?" he snarled. "Powder and your old hands are but as the snail to the swallow against the bright steel in the hands of Alan," says the other. "Before your jottering finger could find the trigger, the hilt would dirl on your breastbane." "Eh, man, where's denying it?" says my uncle. "Pit it as ye please. Hae't your own way. I do nothing across ye. Just tell me what you'll be wanting, and ye'll see that we can agree fine." "Troth, sir," said Alan, "I ask for nothing but plain dealing. In 2 words, do ye want the land killed or kept?" "Oh, sirs!" cried Ebenezer. "Oh, sirs me, that's no kind of language." "Killed or kept," repeated Alan. "Oh, kep it," wailed my uncle. "We had no blood shed, if ye please." "Well," said Alan, "as ye please. That'll be the dearer." "The dearer?" cries Ebenezer. "Would ye file your hands with crime?" "Hoot!" said Alan. "They're both crime whatever, and the killing's easier and quicker and surer. Keeping the lad'll be a fashious job, a fashious kittle business." "I'll have him keeped it, though," returned my uncle. "I never had nothing to do with anything morally wrong, and am no going to begin to pleasure a wild Highlandman." "You're unco scrupulous," sneered Alan. "I'm a man of principle," said Ebenezer simply. "And if I have to pay for it, I'll have to pay for it. And besides," says he, "ye forgot the lad's my brother's son." "Well, well," said Alan. "And now about the price. It's no very easy for me to set a name upon it. I would first have to ken some small matters. I would have to ken, for instance, what ye gave Hoseason at the first off go." "Hoseason!" cries my uncle, struck aback. "What for?" "For kidnapping, David," says Alan. "It's a lie! It's a black lie!" cried my uncle. "He was never kidnapped. He lied in his throat that he told you that. Kidnapped! He never was." "That's no fault of mine, nor yet of yours," said Alan, "nor yet of Hoseason's, if he's a man that can be trusted." "What do you mean?" cried Ebenezer. "Did Hoseason tell ye?" "Why, ye donnered old runt, how else would I ken?" cried Alan. "Hoseason and me are partners. We gang shares. So ye can see for yourself what good you can do lying. And I must plainly say ye drove a fool's bargain when ye let a man like the sailor man so far forward in your private matters. But that's past praying for, and ye must lie on your bed the way ye made it. And the point in hand is just this: what did ye pay him?" "Has he told you himself?" asked my uncle. "That's my concern," said Alan. "Weel," said my uncle, "I dinnae care what he said. He lied. And the solemn God's truth is this, that I gave him £20. But I'll be perfectly honest with ye, for by that he was to have the selling of the lad in Caroliny. Whilk would be as muckle mair, but no from my pocket, ye see." "Thank you, Mr. Thomson. That will do excellently well," said the lawyer, stepping forward; and then mighty civilly, "Good evening, Mr. Balfour," said he. And "Good evening, Uncle Ebenezer," said I. And "It's a braw nicht, Mr. Balfour," added Torrance. Never a word said my uncle, neither black nor white, but just sat where he was on the top doorstep and stared upon us like a man turned to stone. Alan filched away his blunderbuss, and the lawyer, taking him by the arm, plucked him up from the doorstep, led him into the kitchen, whither we all followed, and set him down in a chair beside the hearth, where the fire was out and only a rushlight burning. There we all looked upon him for a while, exulting greatly in our success, but yet with a sort of pity for the man's shame. "Come, come, Mr. Ebenezer," said the lawyer, "you must not be downhearted, for I promise you we shall make easy terms. In the meanwhile give us the cellar key, and Torrance shall draw us a bottle of your father's wine in honour of the event." Then turning to me and taking me by the hand, "Mr. David," says he, "I wish you all joy in your good fortune, which I believe to be deserved." And then to Alan with a spice of drollery, "Mr. Thomson, I pay you my compliment. It was most artfully conducted. But in one point you somewhat outran my comprehension. Do I understand your name to be James? Or Charles? Or is it George, perhaps?" "And why should it be any of the three, sir?" quoth Alan, drawing himself up like one who smelt an offence. "Only, sir, that you mentioned a king's name," replied Rankeillor, "and as there has never yet been a King Thomson, or his fame at least has never come my way, I judged you must refer to that you had in baptism." This was just the stab that Alan would feel keenest, and I am free to confess he took it very ill. Not a word would he answer, but stepped off to the far end of the kitchen, and sat down and sulked; and it was not till I stepped after him, and gave him my hand, and thanked him by title as the chief spring of my success, that he began to smile a bit, and was at last prevailed upon to join our party. By that time we had the fire lighted, and a bottle of wine uncorked; a good supper came out of the basket, to which Torrance and I and Alan set ourselves down, while the lawyer and my uncle passed into the next chamber to consult. They stayed there closeted about an hour, at the end of which period they had come to a good understanding, and my uncle and I set our hands to the agreement in a formal manner. By the terms of this, my uncle bound himself to satisfy Rankeillor as to his intromissions, and to pay me 2 clear thirds of the yearly income of Shaws. So the beggar in the ballad had come home, and when I lay down that night on the kitchen chests, I was a man of means and had a name in the country.
Alan and Torrance and Rankeillor slept and snored on their hard beds; but for me, who had lain out under heaven and upon dirt and stones so many days and nights, and often with an empty belly, and in fear of death, this good change in my case unmanned me more than any of the former evil ones, and I lay till dawn, looking at the fire on the roof and planning the future. End of chapter. Chapter 30 of Kidnapped. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Chapter 30, the final chapter. Goodbye. As far as I was concerned myself, I had come to port, but I still had Alan, to whom I was so much beholden, on my hands, and I felt besides a heavy charge in the matter of the murder and James of the Glens. On both these heads I unbosomed to Rankeillor the next morning, walking to and fro about 6 of the clock before the house of Shaws, and with nothing in view but the fields and woods that had been my ancestors' and were now mine. Even as I spoke on these grave subjects, my eye would take a glad bit of a run over the prospect, and my heart jump with pride. About my clear duty to my friend, the lawyer had no doubt. I must help him out of the county, at whatever risk; but in the case of James he was of a different mind. "Mr. Thomson," says he, "is one thing, Mr. Thomson's kinsman quite another. I know little of the facts, but I gather that a great noble, whom we will call, if you like, the D. of A., has some concern and is even supposed to feel some animosity in the matter. The D. of A. is doubtless an excellent nobleman; but, Mr. David, timeo qui nocuere Dios, if you interfere to balk his vengeance, you should remember there is one way to shut your testimony out, and that is to put you in the dock. There you would be in the same pickle as Mr. Thomson's kinsman. You will object that you are innocent. Well, but so is he; and to be tried for your life before a Highland jury, on a Highland quarrel and with a Highland judge upon the bench, would be a brief transition to the gallows." Now I had made all these reasonings before, and found no very good reply to them, so I put on all the simplicity I could. "In that case, sir," said I would just have to be hanged, would I not?" "My dear boy," cries he, "go in God's name and do what you think is right. It is a poor thought that at my time of life I should be advising you to choose the safe and shameful, and I take it back with an apology. Go and do your duty, and be hanged if you must, like a gentleman. There are worse things in the world than to be hanged." "Not many, sir," said I, smiling. "Why, yes, sir," he cried, "very many. It would be 10 times better for your uncle, to go no further afield, if he were dangling decently upon a gibbet." Thereupon he turned into the house, still in a great fervour of mind, so that I saw I had pleased him heartily, and there he wrote me 2 letters, making his comments on them as he wrote. "This," says he, "is to my bankers, the British Lending Company, placing a credit to your name. Consult Mr. Thomas, he will know of ways, and you, with this credit, can supply the means. I trust you will be a good husband of your money, but in the affair of a friend like Mr. Thomson, I would be even prodigal. Then for his kinsman, there is no better way than that you should seek the advocate, tell him your tale, and offer testimony. Whether he may take it or not is quite another matter, and will turn on the D. of A. Now, that you may reach the Lord Advocate well recommended, I give you here a letter to a namesake of your own, the learned Mr. Balfour of Pilrig, a man whom I esteem. It will look better that you should be presented by one of your own name, and the Laird of Pilrig is much looked up to in the faculty, and stands well with Lord Advocate Grant. I would not trouble him, if I were you, with any particulars, and
Do you know, I think it would be needless to refer to Mr. Thomson. Form yourself upon the laird. He is a good model. When you deal with the advocate, be discreet, and in all these matters may the Lord guide you, Mr. David." Thereupon he took his farewell, and set out with Torrance for the ferry, while Alan and I turned our faces for the city of Edinburgh. As we went by the footpath, and beside the gate posts and the unfinished lodge, we kept looking back at the house of my fathers. It stood there, bare and great and smokeless, like a place not lived in; only in one of the top windows there was the peak of a nightcap bobbing up and down and back and forward, like the head of a rabbit from a burrow. I had little welcome when I came, and less kindness while I stayed; but at least I was watched as I went away. Alan and I went slowly forward upon our way, having little heart either to walk or speak. The same thought was uppermost in both, that we were near the time of our parting, and remembrance of all the bygone days sat upon us sorely. We talked indeed of what should be done, and it was resolved that Alan should keep to the county, biding now here now there, but coming once in the day to a particular place where I might be able to communicate with him, either in my own person or by messenger. In the meanwhile I was to seek out a lawyer, who was an Appin Stewart, and a man therefore to be wholly trusted; and it should be his part to find a ship, and to arrange for Alan's safe embarkation. No sooner was this business done, than the word seemed to leave us; and though I would seek to jest with Alan under the name of Mr. Thomson, and he with me on my new clothes and my estate, you could feel very well that we were nearer tears than laughter. We came the byway over the hill of Corstorphine, and when we got near to the place called Rest and be Thankful, and looked down on Corstorphine bogs and over to the city and the castle on the hill, we both stopped, for we both knew without a word said that we had come to where our ways parted. Here he repeated to me once again what had been agreed upon between us, the address of the lawyer, the daily hour at which Alan might be found, and the signals that were to be made by any that came seeking him. Then I gave what money I had, a guinea or two of Rankeillor's, so that he should not starve in the meanwhile, and then we stood a space, and looked over at Edinburgh in silence. "Well, good bye," said Alan, and held out his left hand. "Good bye," said I, and gave the hand a little grasp, and went off downhill. Neither one of us looked the other in the face, nor so long as he was in my view did I take one back glance at the friend I was leaving. But as I went on my way to the city I felt so lost and lonesome, that I could have found it in my heart to sit down by the dyke, and cry and weep like any baby. It was coming near noon when I passed in by the West Kirk and the Grassmarket into the streets of the capital. The huge height of the buildings, running up to 10 and 15 stories, the narrow arched entries that continually vomited passengers, the wares of the merchants in their windows, the hubbub and endless stir, the foul smells and the fine clothes, and 100 other particulars too small to mention, struck me into a kind of stupor of surprise, so that I let the crowd carry me to and fro; and yet all the time what I was thinking of was Alan at Rest and be Thankful; and all the time, although you would think I would not choose but be delighted with these braws and novelties, there was a cold gnawing in my inside like a remorse for something wrong. The hand of Providence brought me in my drifting to the very doors of the British Linen Company's Bank. End of chapter. End of book. Thank you for listening.